Um,
Yeah.
yeah, one sec. I just need to get off this and. Oh, actually, how are you going to send us the link, or is this Google Chat okay? Oh, okay, it's fine then. Okay, cool, awesome.
Okay. Oh no, it's no worries.
2, 3.
Welcome to all our comrades around the world to the Socialist Sunday Stream.
Okay, welcome everybody to the Socialist Sunday Stream. We're here. Tonight. We have Kathrin, as always, and Anarchopac with us, which is fantastic guest. Dear Anarchopac, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Hi, I'm a libertarian communist YouTuber, and I'm doing a PhD on the history of how anarchists thought about revolutionary strategy, and I'm in the fourth year of it, so I'm currently in the process of finishing it over the next few months, hence why I have not made many videos recently, but I hopefully will soon.
We're with the doctor. What do you know?
Well, not yet. I haven't passed my exam. But
Oh, you will.
How is it going
you
at the
will. I'm
moment
confident.
with your studies?
Yeah.
I just read and write, and it's getting there. But yeah, it should be fine. I'm trying to. I want to include everything, but you can't include everything. So I have a Word document where I put everything that I wish I could include but can't, which keeps getting longer and longer. But it means that I will actually finish, because that's the trap, is you just endlessly perfect rather than like finish it and hand it in.
Yeah, perfectionism is the worst. That actually kind of relates to what we were talking about just before about Tony Robinson and how that kind of whole like thing of work hard, play hard, and like getting everyone to feel like they constantly need to work, constantly need to be perfectionists, and like I don't know. We used to be so obsessed with Tony Robinson and watching all of these like self-help kind of like videos all the time. I watched everything by him, and also the other guy. What's his name? I can't remember the guy's name, but they. Yeah, then I used to think it was normal to just study like 12 hours a day and think and do work constantly. And if I ever took a break, it had to be something that was like educational, like watching a video, watching a documentary or something. I don't know. Those types of people I feel like are so damaging to.
But you know,
so
the guy works hard, but it's mostly a grift. I mean, he gets a lot of reward, a lot of money, a lot of luxury stuff because he's really stealing those people blind. That's the difference. It's not the hard work. He could do no shit, you know, if it just use his charisma and bully these people and not give a fuck and delegate on others and do the same, have the same result economically. You know, he does that because he believes that he's as you said, deep in the system. You know, work hard, play hard, whatnot. You know.
Yeah. Did you go down that like self-help rabbit hole?
No, I was just socialized into like the Protestant work ethic. It wasn't like mediated through like self-help gurus. It was just based on like guilt.
Close enough.
Fair enough. I'm really interested as well, Zoe, in the fact that you say that you're a libertarian, because I don't know, recently I've just seen so much stuff on Twitter like shitting on libertarians. And one, I don't know that much about it, so like maybe you could explain, but also like why you are a libertarian.
Yes, so you have to go through the history of the word here.
Yeah.
So originally, libertarian just meant anarchist.
Yeah.
And it was it was first used by a kind of he's a thinker who existed before anarchism became a social movement called Joseph de Jacques, who calls out Proudhon for being misogynist in a letter. And in the letter, he says that, you're not a libertarian, you're not actually committed to human freedom because of his commitment to patriarchy. And it was then used several decades later by the anarchist movement when loads of anti-anarchist laws were passed where you couldn't have a newspaper or a group with anarchist in the name. So they then start calling themselves libertarians, libertarian communists, etc. And it's still the case that in loads of parts of the world where the meaning of the word hasn't changed, libertarian still means like anarchist communist. What happened in America is that there were a group of right-wing free market fundamentalists who decided to use the term libertarian for themselves, and that then became in America the dominant meaning of the word, because they were connected with very powerful think tanks, the Libertarian Party, things like that.
It does ring a bell, like those Germans who tried to steal the word socialist, right?
Yes, well, they were quite self-aware of what they were doing in America. Because in the 60s, some of the people in this were aware of actual anarchists in the New Left, who called themselves libertarians, and they thought that we're the true believers in freedom, so we should call ourselves libertarians, not these communists. So they quite deliberately stole the word, which now means if you call yourself a libertarian communist, people, especially in America, can start being very confused at how can you believe in free market capitalism and communism at the same time? Which isn't what it means. It means that you're committed to. So sometimes it was just called anarcho-communism, anarchist communism, free communism, but it just means a stateless, classless society based on distribution according to need, in which society is self-managed through a system of, on the one hand, community councils, which are like general assemblies in which everyone has a vote, and workplace councils, which are the same but in a workplace, and they federate in a decentralized way, which means that you have the local level, so all the community councils, workplace councils in the area, they federate to form, say, a regional federation, and all the regional federations then federate together to form a national one, and then so on for an international one. But those federations don't have power to impose decisions on the local workplace and community councils. They're just a means for people over large geographical areas to form agreements, share experiences, coordinate action, rather than it being like a state where you have a kind of top-down system of decision-making.
Yeah, it was basically a steal. And it's funny because the word libertarian here in Spain was had the anarchist meaning for a long time, up to the early 2000s, I guess. It didn't come here to Spain until midway in the 2000s, or maybe the early 2000s, when I left the country and I started hearing the libertarian thing from English speaking channels, because in here you say libertario is gonna be an anarchist, like from the CNT or from the POUM and so on. So it's very much a USA thing.
And it's spread because of the internet around the world. It's one of the reasons.
Yeah, those super super fun guys with fedoras back in the day when fedoras were a thing.
And so would you say that you're quite critical of Marxism in general as you're an anarchist, or?
Marxism's a very big thing.
Yeah.
So I am in favor of combining the best elements of anarchism and Marxism. And so I've read a lot of Marx. I really like him. I think he has a lot of insights. I think he was wrong about parliamentary politics as one of the main means for achieving social change, which he was committed to. And as for his fan club, I'm very against kind of second international Marxism and third international Marxism, which means second international Marxism called itself social democracy, and they tried to implement one of Marx's strategies, which is parliamentary politics, to achieve socialism. And what ended up happening is that over time, as anarchists predicted before this strategy was implemented on a large scale, they became reformists who were no longer seeking the actual abolition of capitalism. Most of those parties end up supporting their relevant sides in World War One. And then it gets to the point today where they, know when they're not connected with their Marxist heritage and essentially just manage welfare state capitalism, hopefully in a slightly nicer way than the right-wing parties, but often on certain things there isn't that much of a difference. And then third international Marxism is the Bolshevik party-inspired Marxism, which was committed to seizing existing state power, in theory, in order to abolish it with a new workers' state. But no party has yet successfully, I think, achieved that, as a workers' state was understood by Marx. And in practice, they end up implementing a one-party state that does loads of things that Marx explicitly opposed, like banning freedom of the press and free speech, which he was a lifelong defender of. I really like council communists, like Anton Pannekow, who I don't think they're the same as anarchists. I think there are substantial differences between what are sometimes called libertarian Marxists and anarchists. But I'm a lot more sympathetic to them than I am to other forms of Marxism as an actually existing social movement. But I think all socialists should read Marx, and especially for his economics, for his social theories, for how his emphasis on human development, the way in which he thinks in terms of processes and relations. Like, these, I think, are really important and had a very big impact on me. Mm-hmm. And I want to take a lot of that stuff and combine it with anarchism. And historically, a lot of anarchists had already done this. So, for example, it's recently been May Day, which honors the death of the Haymarket martyrs. Well, Albert Parsons was familiar with Marx's economics. He quotes it extensively in his writings. The same is true of Carlo Caffero, an Italian anarchist, who wrote a summary of Capital Volume 1, which Marx actually liked, and he disliked most of the summaries that were written because it's difficult.
Yeah.
They'd read summaries, and the summary that often people in the Italian Socialist Party would read one of them was written by Caffero. And in his book Revolution, which he never actually finished because the police arrested him mid-writing it. So there's crucial stuff that I wanted him to say that then in a footnote it's like, and then he gets arrested by the police. So we don't know what he said. But he quotes like Marx's economics in his book. Bakunin was influenced by Marx's economics. So what I'm essentially doing isn't necessarily a new thing. I think I'm just in favor of it to a greater extent than historic anarchists were. It's also important to keep in mind there were lots of historic anarchists who were very much against Marx's social theory and not just his strategy. So Rudolf Rocker, for example, had lots of arguments with Jewish anarchists who were committed to Marx's theory of history as anarchists. And he would spend ages arguing with them about it. Kropotkin was very dismissive of Capital Volume 1. He thought it had kind of like pretensions to be scientific, but actually wasn't super scientific. And I think Kropotkin isn't necessarily right about that. But,
how scientific can you be with sociology, which is like very malleable and pliable, and it's very alive? Societies are alive, so it's very difficult to do like something scientific in a scientific method kind of
Kropotkin
way.
was a geographer and tried to do his own social science and modeled it on various kind of conceptions of science in the 19th century that he liked, which were distinct from Marx. He didn't like Marx's use of like dialectical thinking, and was kind of influenced by different kinds of like positivism to various extents, as far as I remember. It's been a while since I read about this. But I think Kropotkin's like essentially often strawmans Marx, and it's frustrating when the men with beards misrepresent each other, because you like both of them and you're like, no, don't fight.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. I've been there with you two people. You're misreading. You're the other. No, don't be like that. They don't mean that. Stop it.
Yeah, I also think the interesting thing about Marx is like the whole Silvia Federici's argument about how it's important to talk about the subordination of women in relation to how capitalism came about. And that's something that Marx doesn't address as much as he should, or at least, I mean, I haven't read Das Kapital, so...
Yeah, no, he doesn't go talk about that in detail. There is a good book on their views on gender by Heather Brown, and the person who wrote more about it was Engels, using some of Marx's notes. But Marx, he did, for example, make sure that the program of the French Socialist Party, which he co-wrote, one of its first principles is the emancipation of all workers, irrespective of race and gender. And he also, as far as I remember, includes a commitment to equal pay for equal work, which is still a thing that people are campaigning for today, which says how little things have changed since 1880 in certain respects. But he didn't like write a whole book called Gender, this is patriarchy and why it's bad, the book. But lots of other Marxists like have, and it's one of those things where Marxism builds upon Marx rather than necessarily, or good Marxism builds upon Marx rather than just like, let's see what he has to say about every single topic and then repeat it because Marx said it.
And what do you think in general about the current US election and electoral politics in general in relation to your political views? Because I know there's a lot of debates going on at the moment about, vote blue no matter who. And also I feel like there's such pessimism now as a result, or defeatism, I guess, as a result of the fact that Bernie has dropped out. And I think so many people take that and then lose hope completely. And yeah, it depoliticizes and pacifies a lot of people. So I don't know, just wondered what you thought about that and about Bernie in general.
So I think it's important to distinguish between whether or not you should vote with whether or not you should try to achieve social change through elections. And often those things are kind of conflated. So if you make any critique of electoral politics, people are like, aren't you going to like vote to say prevent Trump from being in power? So I think it's really important to separate those things. I think in general, as a rule, people should vote for the least bad candidate if they're in a seat that matters, like not a safe seat. And the reason is for things like, let's say in America, both the parties are different wings of the capitalist party, but it is the case that one of the wings, for example, is actively trying to prevent women from having abortion rights, and the other party is like committed to abortion rights being a thing. And that had a huge impact on people's lives, even though it's a minor difference relative to how much they have in common and the different interests that they serve. So that's one point. As for if you should vote in this election, I don't really know, to be honest. I haven't really thought about it much because I don't live in America. But I think if people do want to vote as harm reduction, even though Biden is like a sex criminal, because they're not voting for him, they're voting for the wider party, voting against Trump, fair enough. If people don't want to vote at all because Biden is a sex criminal and the Democratic Party like went out of their way to prevent Bernie from winning, okay, like I won't attack either person for that decision. I think it's up to them as an individual to think about. As for the question of if you should try to achieve social change through electoral politics, I'm an anarchist, so I say no. Now, the reason why is as follows, which is that if you're on the radical left and you're generally concerned with achieving the abolition of capitalism and the state, then you have to engage in kinds of strategies which can work towards that end. So it might be the case that in an ideal world, electoral politics could give us nicer capitalism, but will a movement focused on electoral politics actually build into a revolutionary movement? And I don't think it will, because if this movement seizes state power, then the leadership of that movement becomes concerned with preserving their own power within the existing capitalist state, which in turn massively affects the people in that movement. And so I don't see it being like a stepping stone to long-term revolutionary change, even if we accept the premise that it might make things better in the short term. Second of all, I don't think it's the case that it's even effective at achieving significant short-term social change, because just because you have won an election, which is very, very difficult to do, the left has consistently failed in America just to win the presidential nominee, let alone win an election. And huge amounts of energy and resources and passion have been spent on this, and it's been unsuccessful without achieving the promised short-term social change. And all that energy could have been better directed into directly struggling for it in the immediate present through direct action. And even if you do win the election, the state exists to perpetuate the rule of the capitalist class. And as a result, there are loads of financial interests which will go out of their way to prevent any socialist politician from being able to achieve any significant change. So there'll be capital flight at best. At worst, there'll be like an invasion. If, say, you're not in America, America will come and make sure you're unable to do anything.
Yeah.
And what can happen is that the politicians who then participate in the capitalist state end up being transformed by it. And there are loads of examples of this in socialist history, where, for example, in France, there were hardcore socialists who were in favor of the general strike, who become politicians, enter into the capitalist state, and before you know it, they are using state violence to brutally repress striking workers. So there was a big strike of railway workers in France, which was ended by a former social conscripted into the army, which means martial law can now be applied to them, which means if they don't go back to work, they can in principle be arrested, even killed on a court martial. So that just totally destroys the strike. And the fact that this happened then led lots of workers in France to become even more disillusioned with parliamentary politics. And even if you do pass laws, doesn't mean they're going to be enforced. So historically, even after labor laws were passed, you still have to have strikes for the implementation of those laws. And also, I think often it's the case that what forces politicians in power and the state in general to implement social change is pressure from below, pressure from outside it through things like trade unions, direct action groups, tenants unions. And if that's the case, then I think the focus should be on building up that bottom-up power rather than trying to capture the existing state, which the left keeps failing to do. So look at Jeremy Corbyn was consistently unsuccessful for loads of different reasons, including the fact that his own party prevented him from winning to a significant extent. The media was totally against him. There was also the incompetence of people on the left and Labour themselves. And I just feel that what has been the end result of that is, one, when people end up losing, when it ends up being unsuccessful, you get loads of disillusioned people who then might not see the point in engaging in politics anymore because they tried so hard and it was pointless. So you get lots of burnout rather than them being like pushed left. But yeah, I'm trying to think of more reasons why it's bad.
I mean, that shit is
I think
rigged,
the main
right?
ones.
That shit is rigged. No matter what you do, no matter who you put in there, there's a lot of charges that are not elected in that have a real power, in our societies that are not elected. You can pick one in your own country, 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 10, 12, from lobbies, corporations to judges. There's so many countries where people don't elect judges. The United States is a kind of an exception. They elect judges. But in Spain, we have a big ass problem with our judges. Our legal system is fucked up because judges they can pick up whoever they want and ruin their lives. They're just basically they're cops. They're just cops with a shrine of authority or of sanctity or whatever. But they're pieces of trash.
And I don't know how much people viewing are like aware of UK politics, but as Zoe was saying, in the UK, we only just recently found out a few weeks ago that people in the Labour Party had actively been trying not to let Corbyn win. And the same with in the 2016 election, Bernie actually won the Democratic primaries, but then they rigged the results and said, actually, no, Clinton has won. So it's just unbelievable to me that didn't get more of like outcry and outrage, and that the fact that they actually deliberately like made the results different than what they are. And I wouldn't be surprised if they've done the same thing this time as well.
I mean, in Latin America, they're doing this thing they call the lawfare, which is the system, the way that they put like Lula da Silva in jail. They put Lula da Silva in jail just before the elections because otherwise Bolsonaro wouldn't stand a chance, and they started the propaganda machine. But otherwise, we would have Lula da Silva as president right now in Brazil, and it didn't happen because they put him in jail on false charges of corruption. That then, after the fact of the election, he got released because they were fake. And the judge that put Lula in jail, he's the Minister of Justice in Brazil. So there's that.
Yeah. But then what would you say, Zoe, to all the arguments of, I guess the counter arguments would be, well, bottom-up stuff or anarchist strategies also haven't been successful or aren't realistic or that kind of thing. What would you say in response?
So, first of all, it depends exactly what you mean by successful, right? So like I don't think there's any revolutionary movement that's actually succeeded in abolishing capitalism in favor of a society in which workers themselves own and self-manage production.
I mean, it's a very steep struggle. Like if you're fighting to change a system where a few people have the power and everything, on their hands, you have nothing but people, and people are like watching TV and bullshit, are distracted. How are you gonna change that? And no matter what recipe you try to implement, the odds are, the whole game is rigged, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, that is a problem. But the second point is that they have success. So there are a number of occasions where they have gotten close or have achieved significant reforms. So, for example, in Spain in 1919, there was a general strike which culminated in Spain granting the 8-hour day, and it was the first country in the world to grant the 8-hour day to like all workers in all occupations, and then they massively repressed the CNT afterwards.
Yeah, at birth, because
well, it was illegal for huge amounts of its existence, but it's also a thing of kind of the closest movements that have gotten to overthrowing capitalism have been ones which engaged in direct action, which it wasn't just anarchist movements. So, leaving aside if anarchist specifically is the right thing, I think the emphasis is that social movements should try to win immediate reforms through direct action. And the reason for this is that direct action, it's not just that it's effective, and is the reason, one of the key reasons why we have the weekend, why there is the 8-hour day in the first place, why it's also an important way of resisting oppression by capitalism, even if you don't necessarily succeed in overthrowing it. But the other reason is that it transforms people who engage in it. So when people engage in direct action, they learn to self-organize their lives. They learn to take initiative. It can have a very strong empowering effect where people kind of unlearn the internalized oppression that they've experienced. And you don't get that in electoral politics. You don't get those kinds of mass transformations in people's ability to organize, self-direct their lives, have radical consciousness, feel incredibly empowered, because the primary thing they're focusing on is trying to get someone else in charge, and persuading other people to vote for that person. So they might get good at persuading people to vote for someone else, or knocking on doors, or doing the kind of day-to-day administration of a political party. But if you're a revolutionary, you want them to be learning how to self-organize their lives, because you're wanting to create a self-organized society in the future that is, communism. And so even if you don't necessarily manage to achieve that goal of abolishing capitalism, the state, because it's very difficult, because they just, it ultimately comes down to the fact that they will just massacre and kill people and repress them. And that's often why left-wing social movements are defeated. It's not because they're not organizing effectively, it's because they don't have as many guns.
Yep.
And even if you don't manage to achieve that, you can still achieve significant improvements in society and massively empower and work towards that revolutionary transformation. And given the kind of very short span we have to try and prevent the worst effects of climate change, I think that's another reason why direct action is so important, because electoral politics is very slow. You have elections, say, every 4 years, and we don't have that time. And even if they did get in power for the reasons I've already given, doesn't necessarily mean they'll be able to do anything. So even if you are committed to the importance of electoral politics, that should be combined with a commitment to direct action, because change has to happen fast. And one thing that can cause fast change is people massively.
Yeah, also at this point in history, like, capitalism is falling apart by itself. You don't have to do much to take it down. But I really love the idea, the concept of dual power structures, which is, I think, one of the most anarchistic things I've ever seen. It's just people taking charge of the things that don't work. And when you show the evidence of that the system is not working, but you also can operate horizontally a system made by the people for the people, and then suddenly you don't even have to actively fight against the current system. You just let it fall and create a better one inside of it that becomes the thing. And then the other thing, the other system just will fall, which is kind of very optimistic, considering how they're very good also at defending themselves. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yes. So there were historic anarchists who were in favor of what the IWW preamble called building the old well in the shell of the old, were committed to the view that ultimately there would have to be a violent confrontation between the counter institutions they'd built, such as huge trade unions, with the ruling classes. So the principles of revolutionary syndicalism adopted by the Anarcho-Syndicalist International, the IWA, in 1922, which were written by Rudolf Rocker, they are explicitly committed to forming workers' militias to overthrow the capitalist class. We're also thinking that you have to, during the struggle against capitalism for immediate reforms like improved wages, living conditions, short hours of work, that's the means to build up a mass movement, which is then capable of launching a armed insurrection. And so if you look at the Spanish Revolution as an example of this, it's sometimes misrepresented as this kind of spontaneous thing, like the fascists. So what happened was there was a fascist coup was launched, and then loads of workers in places like Barcelona took up arms and defeated the fascists in the area. And then there was a long civil war, which the fascists ended up winning for a variety of reasons. But that initial military defeat in places like Barcelona wasn't spontaneous. The anarchists saw a fascist coup coming. The CNT already had an entire network of defense squads, which had lots of combat experience, because there'd been a prolonged, essentially kind of street war with the police and with hired gunmen killing trade unionists, and also robbing banks and attempting to launch insurrections. And these defense squads had detailed planning of where weapons are that we can seize, different positions that we should fire from, the location of troops. And as a result, when the fascists rise up, the anarchists are already prepared to launch their counteroffensive. And part of why they were able to do that was because since 1910, when the CNT was founded, they had been building up these counter institutions, including the defense squads, which were then able to take action at that key moment and militarily defeat the fascist uprising in those specific areas.
And you know, the thing with the Spanish anarchist movement in the 1930s, it was going on way before the coup d'état happened. Like people in the countryside were collectivizing the fields. You know, there was this slogan that was called "La tierra para quien la trabaja," the land for whoever works it. And many places were being collectivized forcibly by the peasants, by the people who worked in that land, right? What happened is it was like the coup d'etat and the whole shebang happened on top of it, but it was already going on. There were like massive strikes. There were massive movements in the mines in Asturias. The miners in Asturias were, you know, struggling. And the thing is, the government of the Second Republic in Spain was like if you know what I mean. They tend to say like, oh, it was the best. When, you know, everybody, you know, many leftists in Spain, they hang proudly their Republican flags on the windows, but you know, to counter the fascist ones. That, yeah, there's a story about the flag, but I think I made a video about it. But I'm digressing as usual. But the revolution, the revolution was happening already, and many places were collectivized just in the countryside, not in the cities, and many resources were, you know, after the war exploded, many resources that were not going to the front, they were going to Barcelona to repress the CNT basically. And it was we were talking about weaponry, we're talking about food and supplies for the army to repress the Barcelona uprising. And not, those guns, those people, that food, all those resources were not going to the front. That was happening like a couple of 100 kilometers southwest, southeast, and southwest, and around Zaragoza and so on. And around that province, and also in the countryside, people were cold. People were having the war was ridiculous. Like more people died of hunger and malfunctioning weapons on our side than from actually enemy fire. It was yeah. Sorry.
But that's surprisingly common in wars that. Most people die. It's from disease, accidents, poor food, and the as opposed to actual combat. Even though loads of people do die in combat, it's just not the majority of deaths.
Yeah. I think the industrial efficiency in war happened. It was right after that, on World War II, and many of those weapons were tested on the fascist side by the Germans and the Italians. It was crazy.
But yeah, the anarchists had lots of problems getting guns. There was lots of attempts where they would have to go to France to meet very shady gun dealers.
Yeah.
To buy like not very good weapons for really, really high prices.
Yeah. Yeah, because there were like international treaties of not intervening on that war.
Yeah.
And it was like, dude. And then you know what happened next.
Yeah. I also wanted to talk to you a little bit, Zoe, about just your experience at university as well, because you did your undergrad in Cambridge, and I don't know, in the UK, Cambridge and Oxford are both like the top of the top, like the elite type of universities, or even globally, I suppose. Yeah. It's one of like the best in the world. And I just wondered, just in general, I think people would be curious your experience in Cambridge and kind of, I don't know, did you experience like elitism? And do you think that those institutions kind of function to reproduce the status quo in a lot of ways? Did you find that it was, I don't know, I'm just curious about the type of knowledge that you get taught in these kind of places and the type of people you interact with, and yeah.
So yeah, Cambridge was underwhelming. Like most people I met were kind of, they can do exams, but they're not necessarily like super smart or like original thinkers. Because our education system doesn't select for that, so good grades don't necessarily correspond to that. And there was a lot of kind of rich people who aren't aware of how rich they are. Like they'll casually talk about the fact they have a horse as if it's not a big thing. Or getting loads of money from their parents to spend on alcohol. So I would interact with some people who thought it was normal to spend, say, like £200 on a night out.
Oh my God.
Which was like unbelievable amounts of money to me. And a lot of the people that I met there, if you go sometimes working in the state in various ways, like in the civil service. So I did philosophy, and a lot of people who do philosophy at Cambridge go on to work in the civil service, which in England is like the state bureaucracy. And it essentially exists to perpetuate the top managerial classes, and because loads of people who go to these universities don't end up being in the ruling classes. Like they don't end up being like politicians or CEOs, although many of them do. A huge number of them end up becoming like managers who earn huge amounts of money doing like very little work. And there's a lot of elitism because people at the university believe the myth about the university, which is that they would refer to themselves as like the best and brightest minds in the country, which is very convenient given that it included them.
Yeah.
And they didn't seem to notice the fact that the implication of this is that the best and brightest minds are overwhelmingly white, and from middle class or upper class families in terms of income. They noticed that for some reason. There's lots of like institutional racism. There's a huge amount of sexism. So there's a massive sexual violence problem on the university, which the university is incredibly bad at dealing with. The way Cambridge works is you have different colleges, which are kind of autonomous in certain respects, who are part of this wider like university. And so if you have a problem, you go to the college, and then the college will say, this isn't a college problem, this is a university problem. You go to the university and they say this is a college problem. And so you're never able to actually really change anything.
That's such bullshit from one of the richest institutions.
And what else is bad about Cambridge? Oh, it has a really toxic like work culture. So like loads of people feel like they constantly should be working, and never have time off. And even if they do have time off, they're not enjoying it because they feel like they could be working.
We've circled back to what we were talking before. That's
That's a massive problem at the uni, and there's lots of mental health problems as a result, just from overwork.
That sucks.
And then the help for people with mental health problems is, of course, incredibly bad and not given huge amounts of money. And there's lots of kind of tokenistic like campaigns of like, yeah, let's talk about mental health, but not change like the structural roots of what's causing it, which is chronic overwork, among other things.
Have you seen that movie, Black Swan? I think it's Darren Aronofsky.
I've not seen the film, but I'm familiar.
I like that film.
I think there's another one called Whiplash.
I've seen, Whiplash is,
It's kind of that obsessive attitude, right? Towards work to death.
Well, that can be a problem for lots of students. Is that just chronic overwork, and it's because you're set so much and you're given. So at lots of universities, the only exams that really matter are your finals and third year. At Cambridge, every year matters. And you have weekly supervisions. So you have to write like a big essay once a week, and you're set hundreds of pages of reading. And some people can handle that, but a lot of people can't. And so what happens is that by the kind of middle of the term, people are just at total breaking point from overwork. And then they have to power through for the next few weeks till the end of term, because terms are only 8 weeks long. And then you have holidays, although I never had holidays. I was working during mine to try and catch up.
Yeah.
And then you go back, and then you have your exams in the third term. So it's like unrelenting.
It's interesting as well, because I think that a lot of people have this idea, you know, the richest or most privileged people have it so easy. But in a lot of ways, like, yeah, even if you're super privileged, like you can have so many mental health issues and so many issues, especially when probably as well, you probably have heightened pressure from family and people around you to succeed if you come from that kind of background. So like, it's just another example of how everyone is harmed under capitalism, just in different ways.
I was about to say that same thing.
Yeah.
The kinds of people go to these universities growing up learn to think of themselves as successful, who they get high grades, they're like the top of the class. And that their entire self-image is built around that. And then they go to Oxbridge and they meet loads of people who are the same, and they no longer feel special because they've learned to base their self-esteem on being better than other people, on grades. And then all of a sudden they're mediocre and they can't handle it because they haven't learned how to build their self-esteem on anything else, like who they are as a person. It's based on like external validation from success. And then when they don't get that to the same extent, they can find it like existentially difficult. It's a kind of, one of the negative effects of the grading doesn't just badly affect people who don't do well in exams. It also, like, I think has bad effects on the people who excel within that system, because they learn to just think of themselves and their worth in terms of their success as measured by certain kind of like academic credentials.
Yeah, and I totally agree with your point about how it just creates, it's not really the smartest of the smart a lot of the time. It's just people who are good at like exams, because I was also very good at getting good grades in exams and things like that, but all that was just like quickly cramming in a lot of information and like regurgitating all of this stuff, just having a good short-term memory, I guess. And then that doesn't lead to there was no critical thinking at all in terms of how we were taught to think at university, or how you taught to think in my school especially. I mean, maybe a little bit more at university, but generally it was definitely very much focused on the politics we were taught was in line with the status quo. You know, we were never taught about Marxism or anarchism or anything slightly more leftist at all. And yeah, in economics, it was definitely very like neoclassical economics rather than Yeah,
It's a little
anything
bit
more
like
radical.
jumping through hoops, right?
Yeah. I also think it's interesting about the sexual violence as well, because it makes me think of all these high-powered, rich men, white men mostly, who are like, who have recently come out for being like sex offenders in different ways. And does this kind of culture of, if you're at the top of the top university and you're taught all your life, you know, you're intelligent, you're better than people, does that then feed into you being, I don't know, like wanting to assert power and dominance over others? Maybe there's a correlation there somehow.
Well, I think so. This is a general problem at UK universities and society at large. It's just that one of the features of universities is kind of a certain kind of drinking culture, and society is based around drinking. And when you get like adolescent men together who consume huge amounts of alcohol and have been socialized to view women as sex objects, can have bad results. Or you get people in positions of authority who abuse that, right? So like lecturers, or in Cambridge it's much worse because you have the supervisions. So you'll go hang out with a teacher and it's just you two in the room. Well, they can then engage in sexual violence against you,
Yeah.
which I know for a fact has happened at Cambridge. Um, and then the university didn't really do anything to in response. But I think there's so there's a general problem with like toxic masculinity, but it's also the case with rich people who are socialized into toxic masculinity can have an extra layer of entitlement that does, I think, affect it. But I'm not so sure it necessarily increases it in terms of them treating they'll interact with waiters worse is one of the main effects. Or I don't know how much it impacts how they treat women. That's different from just general misogyny.
Also, could be like academia is an accurate reflection of
Society, yeah.
society's values, right? I don't know. It's probably a mix of different vectors there.
But I do think it's the case that if they go on to be in positions of power due to their class background, then they will like abuse it, right? Like there are so many cases of CEOs or people in managerial roles.
It is really ridiculous. Yeah. Like sex should be like people rubbing against each other and having a lot of good time, and then they mix power and all these sick things, and they spoil it.
Well, it's also often a thing where like lots of men aren't aware they're rapists because they don't know what rape is. So they assume the sex is consensual because they wanted it. And they have certain kind of rape myths they've internalized, and so they're often not even aware of what they're doing. I think some of them are, but I also think there's a whole other segment where like they don't even know that they're being really terrible, and have like a self-serving image of themselves as like, say, like a ladies' man, where it's like, no, you're actually just engaging in sexual violence.
Yeah, it's a role that you have to fulfill as a man, to be aggressive and it's like a cage.
Yeah. And also something that always... Sorry?
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, I was just saying that as a man, it feels like a cage.
Yeah, and also this idea, I think, is so prevalent that if you say no, that actually it's just that you want them to chase you and you want them to show that they really want you. And so they think that no actually means yes. I think that happens all the time as well.
Yeah, no means no, motherfuckers. Repeat with me. No means no, motherfucker. It's not so difficult, come to think about it. It's just that pressure. The woman has to be the pleaser and the man has to be the hunter. It's like, fuck those roles. Fuck them really hard. It feels like being in a cage of normalcy. Fuck that shit. It harms people also. It's like it harms everybody. It harms who commits the atrocities. It harms who has the atrocities committed towards them. So fuck that shit.
Mm.
Sorry. I think it can also go the other way, and with these like because if, like, for example, I've talked to men who've been sexually assaulted by women, and one of the reasons why it happened is because they said no, but then the woman assumed, for whatever reason, that, well, obviously, men are super horny and always up for sex, so they don't actually mean this.
Yeah.
And if I just make certain moves, they will then have sex with me because that's how men are. And so yeah, it can underpin sexual violence. The gender stereotypes can underpin sexual violence in different ways, both between men and women, rather than just being one way. Although it is the case that statistically, most rapes, as far as I'm aware, excluding men raping other men, are men raping women.
Yeah, and the religious aspect as well. You're not supposed to talk about it openly because it's dirty and shit. Because it's okay to be horny. You're allowed to be horny. You just be horny, but also respectful. You don't stop being a human being because you're horny. That's bullshit.
I think everyone should watch Sex Education. You love it too, don't you, Zoe?
Yes.
Sex Education.
Well, I have critical support for sex education.
Critical support.
There are certain things it doesn't deal with, but I'm glad young people will watch it and it will affect their consciousness.
Yes. Well, the last thing that I wanted to kind of talk about, I don't know if you have other things, Javi or Zoe, but it's kind of disability and leftism in general. I know that you mentioned that there wasn't that much, or you didn't have that much to say about it, but do you think, I guess especially like from your experience, and people in general have often pointed out there's such a lack of discussion about disability, especially on the online left. I would say that's like a topic that's rarely ever addressed. I know Mexi just did a video about her chronic illness, which everyone should definitely go and watch. It's so good. But that video made me realize just how little content there is about disabilities in general. Because yeah, maybe I've just been ignorant and haven't watched the stuff that's out there. So maybe if you guys know more, or anyone in the chat, that would be really useful. But yeah, just
so the left historically wasn't super good on disability, in that, well, the main time they talk about it is when they say, oh, and of course, people who don't work because they're ill, or children, or disabled, or old, will have access to what they need to flourish and live a good life. The CNT at its during its founding did set up a specific group for disabled workers, because so many of their membership had become disabled through industrial accidents. That became a group of people that they had as like a separate thing for. Although that's all I've been able to read about it. I haven't found out about like what they actually did or how long it lasted. But it was a thing that they talked about because so many of the workers had become disabled through working for rich people. And it's an area that I want to read more about, because I know there is like history of, say, disabled social movements, or then there's disability studies, but I've not read about it, but I want to. My main kind of awareness about the politics of disability is the UK government's policies towards the disabled, which are very bad. So in the UK, they set up that they went out of their way to make it as hard as possible to be a disabled person living on benefits as possible. And they tried to make it so as many disabled people as possible were kicked off their benefits and forced into work. So you would have disabled people who had their mobility scooters taken away. You had people killing themselves because their benefits were taken away because they failed they had these tests done by a private company, which would determine if you were considered fit for work. And the tests were like set up to make it so as many people as possible were ruled fit for work. And people who did the tests were made to make sure as many people as possible were fit for work. So it was a kind of a top-down institutionalized attack on disabled people. and yeah, people would, you know, kill themselves or live in poverty, or you have situations of disabled people who, because of government policy, they're not able to move to a house suited for their disability, and so having people living in wheelchairs who have to like crawl around on the floor in their house because it's not set up for moving around easily in a wheelchair. You can go on and on and on. And I've been like reading about it since it began under New Labour, but then got massively worse with under the Tories, the Conservative Party. And I have a disabled best friend, and I kind of watch the policies affect him. And he would, you know, he developed like extreme anxiety from worrying so much about his benefits being taken away and having to apply to go through loads of bureaucracy to try and keep his benefits, which he so far has been able to. But even though he won, it still devastated his life, let alone people who didn't win, having gone through all that anxiety. And so there's a large number of disabled people who died earlier than they were expected to because of these policies. And there was an investigation by the UN which found that the UK government systematically violated the human rights of the disabled. And the government's response was that they said, we disagree with the findings of this report. Our policies are great and help disabled people. And so that's one of the reasons why I was in favour of voting tactically for Labour against the Conservative Party, was just because of how that could hopefully affect the lives of disabled people. And it doesn't get talked about a lot about the left when they go through, well, internationally, it doesn't seem to be known how devastating austerity has been to the disabled in the UK. I think in the UK it is known on the left, although maybe not given as much attention as it should be, but it is at least covered quite a lot in the press, although it's not front page news generally. But yeah, that really depressed me for a really long time. And I kept wanting to make a video about it, but I always found it too depressing to research because I was reading all these stories about people's lives who'd been destroyed, and I just couldn't handle it. At some point, maybe I will make that video, because yeah, I think a lot of people in America, especially, are familiar with how bad it's been, because they often imagine that, you know, England has like a nice health service and has welfare in a way that's better than America, and when it's in many respects differently terrible. Yeah.
Yeah, and in many ways, you know, one of the good uses of a state, and I know this is like a bit of a hot take for many people, but one of the good uses of the state is to use that power to help disabled people go through their lives, you know, with dignity and you know, have, you know, a more full and dignified life. And, you know, do stuff. In Spain we have a disabled politician, a parliamentary member, an MP. You know, he's very, very leftist. I mean, he's moderate leftist, but still, you know, he says a lot of the right things and a lot of the good stuff. And he's a very articulate guy who helped his party, actually, Podemos, the lefty party that came out of the spring protest. They say our Spanish Arab Spring, or Occupy Wall Street, which was like the 15M. And this guy, he's very active on Twitter. He's a great organizer for the party. He's really good with paperwork and stuff. But the guy's in a wheelchair, you know, with physical stuff. But his mental ability is amazing. You know, I wish I could be that good. But you know, I would say that's one of the advantages of that. Going back to the thing of states, you know, with anarchism, mostly, you know, those anarchists, those people who label themselves as anarchists and don't really, you know, measure to the standard.
So historically, anarchists would say that there are good things that states do, which in a free society we wouldn't need them for, but in existing society can be important. And would also say that sometimes it can be appropriate to force the state to do things. This was obviously before welfare states existed.
Yeah, definitely.
But they thought, if you do want to, if it is the case that in capitalism, the institution which is capable of achieving this short-term demand is the state, then okay, but you should achieve that through not entering the state, but imposing pressure on it from outside. And I would say that's the case in terms of contemporary welfare state struggles. So in America, for example, a good thing for a social movement to organize around would be universal healthcare, even though that within existing society is going to be achieved through the state, which long term you, as a revolutionary, you'd want to abolish. Likewise, in the UK, I would want to force the government to stop destroying the lives of the disabled people and have a very good welfare program for them, even though that would not be necessary in a communist society because you don't have money anymore, you have distribution according to need, so they would automatically be fine. And so I think there's kind of at least in the UK, the majority of the anarchist movement were in favour of opposing austerity, defending the existing welfare state from cuts, even though long term they don't want it to be a thing or have problems with it as it currently exists.
I mean, because it's kind of different, how we relate to current states that exist right now, and the fact that there are many different ways to configure a state. You can configure a state to be like the Pinochet dictatorship, and it's a state. You can have a state that serves the people, that is accountable to the people, that in which you vote for every major decision and not politicians do it for you, and that's still a state. And I wonder, maybe that's not a state and it's a government. I don't know what does difference. What's the difference between a state and a government, if you know what I mean?
So some anarchists would distinguish between the two and say we're in favor of self-government against the state. Other anarchists would define government as what other anarchists call the state. So I tend to just talk about the state and government as being the same thing. Being abolished in favor of a decentralized system of workplace and community assemblies.
Yeah.
In actual fact, and the reason for it is as follows, which is that they think states are centralized hierarchical institutions based on minority rule by a political ruling class, which is distinct from any economic ruling class they might serve.
But in a way, that's a very narrow definition of a state.
Well, it's
right?
a definition that they've created based on analysis of states as they actually exist. And I don't think there's a single state in history that it doesn't apply to, including self-proclaimed socialist or states ruled by communist parties. They're based on top-down decision-making by a minority of people, even if those people are elected. Is still the case that you have anarchists were against delegation. They were against granting decision-making power to a minority of people who then can impose decisions on other people through violence, ultimately. Instead, they wanted a system in which any delegation that happens is delegation of tasks. So people have certain administrative duties they do, like they're a secretary of a group or they look after the correspondence, and they attend congresses where they pass resolutions for the organization, but they're mandated on what to vote at those congresses by the General Assembly that elected them as a delegate, and they're instantly recallable. So if they don't like what the delegate's done, they can immediately recall them or replace them. And crucially, that delegate doesn't actually have their own independent decision-making power as a minority to impose on other people.
Yep.
They instead only have a task delegated, and the decision-making power remains in the hands of the General Assembly. The main exception for this, although it was controversial among some anarchists, was obviously like in combat situations, you want to you grant someone to have decision-making abilities in immediate fighting, but doesn't mean the rest of society has to be like that, and it doesn't mean outside of combat things have to be like that.
Kind of the division between justified and unjustified hierarchies, right?
Well, that isn't how the historic movement ever talks about it. That's kind of a move. That's a phrasing that comes in because of Chomsky, and then people like watching his like videos of him on YouTube. But historically, they just talk about how you should have elected officers in any anarchist like military system, and they would try to like discuss tactics before battle, but in battle, if your elected officer says we're going to do a flanking maneuver, you do the flanking maneuver.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
But they just talk about it in terms of it being a necessary thing in order to win. And pirates would do a similar thing historically, actually. Pirate captains would have power in combat, but not outside, and they were elected and revocable. So it's not just it's quite an obvious solution to the problem that people in other contexts independently also came up with.
It's democracy at war. But
yeah.
I like that those systems implement a lot of accountability, which is something that's lacking in our current quote unquote democracies, if you know what I mean.
Well, yeah, so it's kind of interesting that historically, so now a lot of anarchists talk about how, including myself, that we're in favor of like a system of direct democracy, and historically anarchists would oppose democracy, and by that they meant currently existing representative democracy, based on you elect representatives who then make decisions in a top-down manner, and they would just call their system of decision making, like, yeah, we're going to have a majority voting system, or like in a general assembly, or
one other thing that pisses me off is now in these quote unquote democracies that we live in is that we vote for people, not for issues, specific.
Well, it's issues. It's like kind of celebrity culture.
Yeah.
For politics.
Yeah, I hear you there. It's terrible. I made a video about direct democracy versus representative democracy and everything else. It's just it's a little bit in Spanish, but there are English subtitles for it. But yeah, I hear you there. I'm more for me myself. I'm more for direct democracy. I don't know what you guys think.
Well, I'm in favor of direct democracy but based on like specific anarchist principles how to organize it.
Kathrin, what do you think?
I actually have to go because I've got to give my laptop back.
Yeah, okay.
Oopsie
well,
daisy.
My friend's laptop back to her.
It was nice talking.
You're gonna wrap it up. You want to wrap it up? Okay. So it's been a pleasure to have you with us, and we'll see you soon. Okay.
Thank you so much for coming, Zoe, after even whilst you're doing your PhD and you're super busy.
We need to do a do-over as well, Zoe, for real. It's a pleasure.
There's so much more to talk about. So
yes, there's always more.
Okay, good people, thank you so much for joining the Socialist Sunday stream as well. We'll have a next guest next week. And will be more fun and games. Sorry, we've been away for a few weeks because of technical problems and whatsoever. But yeah, so good to have you with us, and more fun and games soon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.